This is Outside of New York. In-depth discussions with members of the art world who live and work outside of New York. And here's your host, Craig Gould.
Mary Vernon is a Dallas-based artist and former educator. Mary spent nearly 50 years at Southern Methodist University, where she taught art history, painting, and drawing, as well as SMU's noted color theory course. Originally from New Mexico, she completed her undergraduate degree at Cal Berkeley and her MFA at the University of New Mexico, Albuquerque. Mary's paintings reflect the color theories she so famously taught at SMU. One of her most recent works, Albers House, is a 36-foot-long oil painting on yupo, which was featured in a retrospective at the Grace Museum in Abiliene. Mary's work can be found in notable local collections such as the Belo Foundation, the George W. Bush Presidential Library, Meadows Museum, the Dallas Country Club, and the UT Southwestern Medical Center. Mary is represented in Dallas by Valley House Gallery. I recently sat down with Mary at her Dallas studio where we discussed early inspirations, Berkeley in the 60s, her love of art history, the evolution of the Meadows collection, her impact on generations of art students, her love of yupo, and a run-in with Georgia O'Keeffe. Okay. Mary Vernon, thank you so much for being willing to sit down with me and have a conversation.
Delighted.
Yeah, great. So, Mary, where does your story begin? Is it New Mexico? Is that right?
You mean being born in New Mexico?
Well,
yes, that's where it begins. Sure.
Right. So, what? Where does your? If we're going to maintain this, keep the story just to art, where were your formative years? Where did you figure out that you were an artist?
Well, I often tell in lectures my first and best painting was made when I was about 6. I still wish I could paint that painting. And I've described it before. When you have sash windows, you need, eventually, they don't hold up.
Right.
You have to have a stick to hold the window open.
Right.
There was such a stick in my bedroom.
Wow.
A kind of nice, wide pine stick.
Absolutely.
So I happened to abscond with 2 tiny tubes from my next-door neighbor's painting set.
Sure.
One blue, one magenta. And I painted 2 stripes down the whole stick, one on one side, one on the other.
Right.
Most beautiful thing ever. Yeah, if I could paint those 2 stripes on that stick again.
Sure.
So that's exactly what I'm doing, is trying to return to the stick always.
Right.
That was the first and best painting.
Right.
But I also thought when we were discussing this conversation today that there were museums in my little hometown, but and there were artists in the state, but the formative thing was a kind of museum-like experience, which was, as far as I know, the major coffee table book of 1939,
right,
which was Rockwell Kent's favorite. And I pored over that book
right,
year after year, so that I got really familiar with all the quirky choices of Rockwell Kent's in the book. And about 2005, I was working on remembering, for a little autobiographical thing, what it was about moments in that book. And I wrote my remembering of what it was to look at one of the paintings, which was a Nattier. And I printed it. You want me to read to you what I wrote in 2005?
Absolutely.
I can always send you the Nautier painting, but that I took from the book. It has to be the bad reproduction, not the good one, not as you would get it now. So I was writing about perhaps being 8 years old, but this was written in 2005. I said, I think, for example, of the first significant art book of my life, Rockwell Kent's, quote, world-famous paintings of 1939, the waist of Nautier's Smoky Lady, or the whole of her portrait. In only one way was Nautier's portrait of Madame Sophie essential to me as a lover of paintings. It spoke for painting itself as opposed to painting as a container for stories. The Nautier disturbed and enlightened. About that waist there was nothing human, but all beautiful. Had I known, I might have seen faint echoes of the surfaces of Goya's and Rembrandt's. But what I did see was a hard and crisp beauty, thinness of the flowers, delicious fakery, the skin of a surface preferred over the solidity of structure, the bow of the sort I yearned to see, fresh, rustling, and almost scented. Her bodice was a hoard of golden and silver crusts. Nothing was inside that shell. Nothing needed to be. She was a surprise, coming after the solidities of Albertinelli or Velázquez. Both of them were in the book, of course. Mm-hmm. Nautier's Sophie was the woman of smoke. Refinement was limitation. Color became a matter of which shade of gray was preferred. I had no ambition toward this for myself. It was impossible. Not real and long past. Madame Sophie was as admirable as a caged monster. But Nautier sent out his sensibilities to me like spores in the wind. The fake flowers, the grayness, the golden lace, the hold of sadness on something once known and forgotten. It's always just beyond my reach, the meaning that this particular beauty should have for me. I never looked for this painting at Versailles. I want the painting to look like the poor reproduction in Rockwell Kent's book.
It's very interesting that you fell in love with this this image in all of its imperfection.
Right. And it's unreachable perfection.
Right.
And it's fake and silly perfection.
Sure. There's part of that story that reminds me of my childhood. That I grew up, in a small Texas town. My father worked in aircraft manufacturing, and my mom was an office manager for an agricultural chemical company. And I started taking painting lessons when I was like 9 or 10, but my access to art beyond those little painting lessons, it just wasn't there. But in our home, there was a coffee table Bible, the big, kind of fancy presentation Bible. Mm-hmm. And in the middle of that Bible were 12 full-color reproductions of El Greco's Apostles, right?
Well, the best illustration.
Right. And so I loved looking at those reproductions. And when I think back about when did I first go to an art museum, in my memory, it wasn't until I was in high school and I had the opportunity to go to Spain.
So you had to go to Spain to go to the museum?
Right. And my first art museum that I went to was the Prado.
That's the best to go to first.
Right. And those 12 disciples were in the Prado.
Oh, really?
Right. Uh-huh. And I remember walking in there and I was just dumbfounded. And of course, I have very distinct memories of other pieces that, I think you've been to the Prado. I think you know.
Yes. I can remember a day when it must have been in the 70s. I don't remember doing it before. When I saw The Garden of Earthly Delights and Las Meninas and May 3rd, 1808 by Goya, all in the same day, which is common because they were all on the same floor and they were major features of. But there was something about the validity of each one of them as perfect for what it tried to do.
Sure.
That just made you faint away with the decision that if you couldn't do this, you couldn't paint.
Right. No, and I mean, I remember just having very distinct memories of seeing those pieces and just like, Bosch's Earthly Delights. I'm just like, I've never seen anything like this before. And to think of him creating that in the time period that he did, it's even more surreal, right?
I guess the world was more surreal then.
So you grew up looking at these Rockwell Kent illustrations, and you had the first painting with that piece of pine. Was it pine?
I'm sure it was.
And where did you start turning that into more practice? Was it nurtured in grade school or high school, or did you take lessons, or when did you start putting paint to canvas?
I was the only faculty I was exercising was perception, staring at things. I was much better at staring at things than in making products of any kind. I believe that my grade school and even my junior high school art class were sidelines, and actually I think probably in a good way, teaching all the stuff that actually didn't need to be done. Things like papier-mâché puppet heads that then you could put on a play with. It wasn't a direction I was going to go. In Catholic school, what we mostly did was color in mimeographed things that had been made on the machine. So we all have to do them exactly alike, which tells you a lot. But this is something that was just completely aside. It belonged to a world that was not as significant as what was in the Roswell Museum, which was really probably the best Victor Higgins landscape in the world. A lot of Peter Hurd paintings, which were at least showed you a great deal about how to paint in tempera. There was a coterie of people, literati, who had been to the major museums and knew everyone. So it was as if there was a life for the perceiver. There was not necessarily requirement that I make any of it.
Right.
And I thought that the perception was probably much more medical than it was aesthetic. I thought I was going to go to medical school.
Interesting.
And I find in my students that there's a really close parallel between pre-med and pre-art, if you want to call it that.
Well, I mean, that just makes me think right away of Da Vinci, right? In all of those classical drawings that the Queen owns, were his attempt of making one of her first illustrated medical texts, but he was such a perfectionist that he never finished it, right? But there is, I do hear of surgeons and medical, folks in the medical field that do have a love and appreciation of art.
Well, I think medical students often are in the wrong major. Pre-med students, which I was in college.